Hi everybody, Steve Matthews here with this week's video update. This is episode number 15. Today I'm going to be talking about what I thought was a pretty remarkable op-ed piece that appeared in the New York Times this past week. And this particular piece was written by John Paul Stevens. If you're not familiar with that name, John Paul Stevens is he's a retired Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. So he's a pretty heavy hitter. And his op-ed piece appeared in the New York Times, what people like to call the newspaper of record. And writing something in the New York Times is a big deal. Now, I'm not saying that simply because it's written in the New York Times that it's good. In fact, I disagree with just about everything, just about all the editorial stances of the New York Times. But the fact is, the New York Times carries a lot of weight. And so when you have a gentleman who's a very prominent individual write an op-ed piece for them, that gives it even more weight. So let's take a look at this essay. I want to break this down for you. So here we go. We've got this op-ed here. It appeared on March 27th, 2018. And the headline says, John Paul Stevens, repeal the Second Amendment. So he cuts right to the chase. And you can see here we've got a picture of two guns right here on top. And you've got this is an 18th century sort of Revolutionary War musket. And then underneath that, you have a modern day AR-15. And I don't know why these pictures necessarily appear here. Maybe it's to try to shock and to scare people. You know, the gun, the musket, it looks historic. It has a certain maybe antique beauty to it. Whereas in contrast to that, the AR-15 looks, well, pretty darn scary. And I guess maybe the message, I'm kind of trying to draw an inference here, but maybe the message is, well, technology has just advanced so much that, this whole Second Amendment thing is just a relic of the 18th century. And with the technology we have today, we really, really don't want people actually keeping and bearing arms. Maybe that's the thought. That's one possibility. So anyway, let's dive into this op-ed piece and see what John Paul Stevens says. So here he begins. He says, rarely in my lifetime have I seen the type of civic engagement school children and their supporters demonstrated in Washington and other major cities throughout the country this past Saturday. These demonstrations demand our respect. They reveal the broad public support for legislation to minimize the risk of mass killings of school children and others in our society. Well, yeah, I think it's interesting. He seems to have this idea that civic engagement is good almost in and of itself. Well, I guess I would say civic engagement can be good or it can be bad. I mean, it really kind of depends on what the agenda is you're trying to push. Yeah, I wonder if John Paul Stevens would be so enthusiastic maybe about, say, NRA folks defending the Second Amendment. I wonder if he would consider that civic engagement that demands respect. I'm thinking maybe probably not. But let's continue here. It says that support is a clear sign to lawmakers to enact legislation prohibiting civilian ownership of semi-automatic weapons, increasing the minimum age to buy a gun from 18 to 21 years old, and establishing more comprehensive background checks on all purchases of firearms. Now, what he did there, those 3 points that he just laid out, that's essentially the talking points of the March for Our Lives folks. That big demonstration they had Saturday, March the 23rd, a week ago at this point, last weekend, where you had a whole bunch of people who go to Washington and cities throughout the United States and even in cities elsewhere in the world. They rose up to demonstrate against the civilian ownership of firearms. And what they said, it was kind of interesting because the March for Our Lives people, when they were challenged, they said, "Oh no, we don't want to ban guns. We don't want to take your guns. We don't want to grab your guns. We just want common sense gun laws." And for them, common sense gun laws were prohibiting the ownership of semi-automatic weapons, particularly AR-15s. They wanted to increase the age one was allowed to purchase a gun, and they also wanted to have souped up background checks. So really, John Paul Stevens kind of echoes their talking points here. But he adds something. He actually goes beyond that. He says, but the demonstrators, this is Stevens again, he says, but the demonstrators should seek a more effective and more lasting reform. So all of these things banning semi-automatic weapons, increasing the minimum age that are required to buy a gun, background checks. That's really just greasy kid stuff. That's really not what we need to aim for. This is what John Paul Stevens says. He just lays it right out here, and I guess I should be happy that he's at least honest and he's upfront, even if I disagree with what he says. So here's what Stevens says. He says he's talking about the March for Our Lives folks, they should demand a repeal of the Second Amendment. So John Paul Stevens just lays all his cards out there on the table. He doesn't beat around the bush. He just comes right out and says it, which, of course, is what I've always thought was the whole purpose of a March for Our Lives anyway. They get up there and they talk, oh, we want to do this, and, we want to do a little incremental step here, a little incremental step there. No, Stevens says none of that stuff. We're going to go for the gusto. We're going to repeal the Second Amendment. And so he comes right out and says it. Now, he supports his claim by offering a few points here. So let's continue. The next paragraph, Stevens says this. He says, concern that a national standing army might pose a threat to the security of the separate states led to the adoption of that amendment, which provides that, quote, and this is a quote from the Second Amendment, quote, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And he says today that concern is a relic of the 18th century. Well, I don't know. It's kind of interesting. He seems to think that's a relic of the 18th century. But it seems to me that governments today are just as potentially oppressive as governments were in the past in the 18th century. In fact, maybe even more so. There was a book that was written, I don't know, maybe about 20 years ago or so. It has this really cheery title. It's called Death by Government. Yeah, go out and read that, huh? A little summer beach reading there for you. Death by Government. It's by a gentleman named R.J. Rummel. He was, I don't know, maybe he still is. I don't know if he's still alive or not. But R.J. Rummel, he wrote this book. He was I believe, a political science professor, and it's called Death by Government. And what he does is he goes through and he looks at all these instances of what he called democide in the 20th century. And democide was just mass killing of citizens by their governments. And the long and the short of it is, without kind of a 35,000 feet view of this, the high-level view, what Rummel found is, in his estimation, governments in the 20th century killed 169 million people. So, the threat of tyranny, of tyrannical governments, is not something that's a relic of the 18th century. It's very much with us to this very day. Now Stevens continues. He says, for over 200 years after the adoption of the Second Amendment, it was uniformly understood as not placing any limit, note well, as not placing any limit on either federal or state authority to enact gun control legislation. Now that's an extraordinary statement because in the paragraph right before that, what Stevens said, he quoted the Second Amendment, and the Second Amendment says, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And then in the very next paragraph, he says, it was uniformly understood as not placing any limit on either federal or state authority to enact gun control legislation. Now that seems like a pretty extraordinary statement to me. How you get from shall not be infringed to stating that the Second Amendment placed no limit on federal or state authority to enact gun control legislation, I think is, well, I think that really just underscores the irrationality of our political debate today. I don't think you can get from the Second Amendment to John Paul Stevens' statement here. I don't think that's logically possible. But I think it's an extraordinary statement nonetheless, and I think it really does reveal his state of his love of illogic, maybe more than anything else. Well, Stevens continues here, and he quotes former Chief Justice Warren Burger, who talked about the NRA, which defends gun owners' rights, the Second Amendment. He talked about the NRA as, quote, as perpetrating, quote, one of the greatest pieces of fraud, I repeat the word fraud, on the American public by special interest groups that I have ever seen in my lifetime, end quote. Well, I don't know. I think it was under Chief Justice Burger that the abortion law was passed in 1973. Burger was Chief Justice from 1969 to 1986, and somehow they intuited somewhere in the Constitution a right for women to kill their kids. But the NRA is a fraud. But Roe v. Wade, that's not a fraud. That's a good thing. And anyway, John Paul Stevens continues here. He talks about a Supreme Court decision that took place back in 2008. He said in 2008, the Supreme Court overturned Chief Justice Burger's and others' long-settled understanding of the Second Amendment's limited reach by ruling in the District of Columbia v. Heller that there was an individual right to bear arms. I was among the 4 dissenters, so John Paul Stevens dissented from that 2008 decision by the Supreme Court that actually found that individuals, the Second Amendment actually guarantees individuals the right to keep and to bear arms. This is not hard. I mean, again, if we go back to the language of the Second Amendment, and again, we're going back to, I'm just quoting the Second Amendment as John Paul Stevens cited in his article. It says the right of the people. Notice well, it doesn't say the right of the militia, it doesn't say the right of the National Guard, it doesn't say the right of the Army, it says the right of the people. And this is talking about individual citizens here. The right of the people to keep and to bear arms shall not be infringed. The Second Amendment guarantees the rights of individuals, just like the other amendments of the Constitution guarantee the rights of individuals. So finally here, kind of wrap things up. John Paul Stevens writes, that decision, which I remain convinced was wrong and certainly was debatable, has provided the NRA with a propaganda weapon of immense power. So the NRA, by defending the Second Amendment, they're not standing up for the Constitution, they're propagandists. And he goes on, he says, overturning that decision via a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Second Amendment. He wants to get rid of it. He just comes right out and says it. The Second Amendment would be simple and would do more to weaken the NRA's ability to stymie legislative debate and block constructive gun control legislation than any other available option. Now, what he means by constructive gun legislation is the ability of the federal government, I guess the state government, to grab your guns. That's very clearly what he thinks is constructive gun control legislation. And he continues here in his final paragraph. Stevens says, that simple but dramatic action, that is, repealing the Second Amendment, would move Saturday's marchers closer to the objective than any other possible reform. Well, that's true. That is certainly a true statement. It would eliminate the only legal rule that protects sellers of firearms in the United States, unlike every other market in the world. Well, I don't know about every other market in the world. There are certainly countries, Switzerland and Israel, for instance, I believe have even more free gun legislation, at least I've been told this, than what is the case in the United States. But I guess really what John Paul Stevens wants is he wants the United States to be like every other nation in the world. Well, the whole point of the Constitution, or at least certainly one of the points of the Constitution, is the United States is not supposed to be like every other country in the world. It's a country that's governed by a constitution that guarantees the rights of its citizens. And that was a revolutionary idea at its time, and it's still a revolutionary idea. A lot of people are still put off by that. I'm glad that the United States is not like every other country in the world. That's a good thing. It kind of reminds me a little bit in the Old Testament. The people came to the prophet Samuel and said, make us a king so we can be like all the other countries in the world. Well, that didn't work out so well for them. God condemned them for that. And I would say it would be a big mistake for the United States to try to be like every other country in the world. But John Paul Stevens thinks that's a good idea. Well, anyway, my time's about up today. Thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate that. If you like this video, give me a like, give me a thumbs up, and also don't forget to subscribe. I love subscribers. I'll talk to you next time. You take care. This is Steve Matthews. Goodbye.